Hey everyone, welcome. You've been giving us some really interesting notes, all about test documentation.
Yeah, looks like you've been really diving deep into this whole world of software testing and quality assurance.
Exactly, and we're here to help you kind of pull out the most important stuff.
Yeah, help you make sense of it all.
Yeah, and maybe uncover some surprises along the way.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So today we're going to be unpacking, the why, the what, and the how of test documentation.
So by the end, you'll be ready to tackle documentation like a pro.
Yeah, you'll have all the knowledge you need to really navigate this crucial part of software development.
It's a big one for sure.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the big why.
Yeah, why bother with all this paperwork, right?
Exactly. Especially if you're new to software development, you might be thinking, is all this documentation really necessary?
Yeah, I mean, isn't testing just about, running the code?
And seeing if it works.
Yeah, does it break?
Does it do what it's supposed to?
Yeah, exactly.
What's the point of all the documentation?
So you're right, running the code is definitely part of testing.
Right.
But in the real world testing, it has to be a lot more than just, kind of randomly trying things out.
Yeah, it's not just like ad hoc poking around.
Right. It's got to be a structured process. It's
Right.
got to be rigorous. Imagine building a bridge without blueprints.
Oh, yeah, that's a scary thought.
Right. You wouldn't do that.
It's definitely not a good idea.
You need those detailed specs to make sure everything's safe and sound.
So you're saying documentation is like the blueprints for our testing,
Exactly. It's the blueprint for making sure our software is reliable.
and it meets all the requirements.
And just like with that bridge, those blueprints help make sure that the final product, is safe and it's reliable and it does what it's supposed to.
That's a really good point. So
Yeah.
basically, it's all about making sure that what we build is high quality.
Absolutely. Documentation in software testing, it makes the whole process verifiable.
Verifiable? How so?
Anyone on the team should be able to pick up the documentation and understand exactly what was tested, how it was tested, and what the results were.
So it's like a record.
Yeah, it's a record, and it makes everything repeatable.
So if we need to go back and retest something,
Yeah, you can follow the steps, exactly.
we know exactly what to do.
Exactly.
So it's not just about finding bugs.
No.
It's really about having a systematic approach to quality.
Yes. It's about making sure that the software is consistently good.
That makes total sense. And it's really about creating that shared understanding and making sure everyone on the team is on the same page.
Absolutely. And here's a little tidbit that might surprise you. Testing often takes up a huge chunk of the development process.
Oh, really? Like how much are we talking?
Sometimes 30 to 50%.
Wow. 30 to 50%. That's way more than I would have guessed.
Right. It's a big deal.
So having good documentation is essential in making that process as efficient as possible.
Right. Think of it this way. Thorough documentation, it streamlines the whole thing.
Makes it more targeted.
Makes sure that testing is effective.
So we're not wasting time.
Exactly. Plus, it can help you identify areas for improvement down the line.
Oh, interesting. How so?
You can analyze your past documentation, spot patterns, learn from mistakes, and just keep getting better.
So it's like a continuous improvement kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've established that, documentation is super important.
Yeah, it's the backbone of good testing.
But how formal does it need to be? Is there like a dress code for these documents?
That's a great question. And yeah, it's kind of like choosing the right outfit.
Yeah.
The level of formality in your test documentation, it really depends on the occasion.
Okay, so what are some of the things that kind of influence that dress code?
Well, there are three main factors to consider. First, the type of application you're testing.
Okay, so like what kind of software are we building?
Exactly. Are we talking about, a game?
Right,
Or are we talking about something like a medical device?
right. Something with really high stakes.
Exactly. If you're building something safety critical, like a medical device or flight control software, the stakes are much higher.
Yeah, a bug could be disastrous.
Exactly. So you need a very, very high level of formality.
Right. Every detail has to be perfect.
You got to make sure you've covered everything.
Makes sense. Higher stakes mean higher need for that super detailed documentation.
Right. The second factor is your organization's standards and practices.
Okay, so different companies might have different expectations.
Exactly. Some companies are really strict.
They want everything documented down to the last detail.
Right. While others are more flexible,
Right.
it's important to know what your company expects and to stick to those guidelines.
So even if I'm like a documentation rock star,
Yeah,
I got to make sure I'm playing the right tune for my company's orchestra.
exactly. And the third factor is the maturity of your development process.
Oh, interesting.
As teams gain experience and refine their processes, documentation often becomes more streamlined.
More efficient.
Right. It's an evolving process. It adapts to the needs of the team and the project.
So it's not like we just create a document at the beginning and it's set in stone,
No, it's a living thing. It grows and evolves.
just like the software itself.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now I'm really curious about all these different types of documents we find in software testing.
Oh, yeah, we got a whole toolkit here.
So what's the first tool we pull out?
Let's start with the foundation. The test policy.
Okay, the test policy.
Think of this as the mission statement for testing in your organization.
Oh, okay.
It outlines the big picture stuff, the overall principles, the methods and goals of testing.
So it sets the stage.
Exactly. It's the guiding document.
So it's kind of like the Constitution that guides all the testing laws
Yeah.
in our little software kingdom.
Exactly.
But a Constitution needs more specific law, right? What comes next?
You got it. Next up, we have the test strategy.
The test strategy.
This dives deeper.
So it's more specific.
It outlines the types of testing we'll be doing for this particular project. It's our strategic battle plan to conquer those bugs.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So we've got the Constitution, and now we've got the battle plan.
Right.
But what about the actual boots on the ground?
That's where the test plan comes in.
Okay, the test plan.
This is the detailed roadmap for the entire testing process.
Okay, so this is where we get into the nitty-gritty.
We're talking about the scope, the features, we're going to test the environment, the roles and responsibilities, and how we define success.
Right, so this is where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly.
We're laying out exactly what needs to be tested and how.
Now, as we start testing specific things,
Right.
we need a way to connect the dots between the software requirements
Okay.
and the actual tests themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. We want to make sure everything is covered.
That's where the requirements traceability matrix comes in.
Ooh, that sounds kind of complicated.
It's really not. It's basically a table that links each requirement to its corresponding test case.
So we can make sure nothing falls through the cracks.
Right. Like a detective's board.
I like that.
Now, speaking of test cases, let's talk about test scenarios
Okay, test scenarios.
and test cases. A test scenario is like a user story.
Oh, okay, so it's from the user's perspective.
Exactly. It describes a specific function or feature from their point of view.
So it sets the scene.
Right. It tells us, what are we testing here?
Okay, so the test scenarios is the context.
Yeah.
But how do we actually test that scenario?
That's where the test case comes in.
Right, the test case.
It breaks the scenario down into specific steps,
Okay,
inputs, and expected outcomes.
so it's super detailed.
Yeah, it's like a set of instructions for a robot.
Oh, I like that.
The robot needs to know exactly what to do.
To make sure it's testing the right thing.
Exactly.
But what about the data we use for testing? Do we just use any random information?
Nope. That's where test data comes in.
Okay, test data.
This refers to the specific data sets we use to execute those test cases.
So it could be things like usernames and passwords.
Yeah, or input values or database records, anything really.
So it's kind of like using the right ingredients in a recipe.
Exactly. You want consistent and accurate results.
We wouldn't want to use salt instead of sugar.
Exactly.
So we've got our test cases and our data.
We're ready to roll.
But what happens when we find a bug?
Ah, that's where the defect report comes into play.
Ah. Oh, that doesn't sound good.
Well, it's not ideal, but it's part of the process.
So what is a defect report?
It's a detailed document
Okay.
of any bug or flaw that pops up during testing.
So it's like an official bug report
Right. We got to document everything.
that the developers can fix it.
Exactly.
Okay, and what happens when all the testing is done?
Hmm.
Do we just high five and call it a day?
Not quite. We got to wrap things up with a test summary report.
The test summary report.
Yeah.
It's like the final report card for our software.
Got it.
It provides a high-level overview of what we tested, how many tests passed and failed, and any outstanding issues.
So it's like a summary of everything we've done.
Exactly. It highlights the key takeaways.
So we can see the big picture and figure out what needs more attention.
Okay, great. So we've gone through all the main types of documents you're likely to see in software testing.
Yeah, it's quite a collection.
It is. We've gone from the big picture stuff, like the test policy,
Yeah, the foundation.
down to the nitty-gritty details, like test cases.
Yeah, the step-by-step instructions.
But now I'm wondering, how do we make sure all this documentation is actually effective?
Ah, great question. That brings us to our next topic. Best practices.
So how do we make this documentation work for us?
Exactly. How do we make sure it adds value to the testing process?
But before we jump into that,
Yeah.
let's take a quick pause
Yeah. Catch our breath.
and give you a chance to absorb all this info.
We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive. All right, so we're back and ready to dive into best practices.
Yeah, let's talk about how to make this documentation really work for us.
Okay, so one of the most important things
Yeah.
is to get the QA team involved early,
Oh, early. Like, how early are we talking?
as early as possible, ideally right from the beginning of the project.
Oh, wow. So, like, even before any code is written.
Yeah, the sooner they're involved, the better they can understand the requirements.
Makes sense. The more they know, the better they can plan the testing.
Exactly. And they can start thinking about potential testing scenarios right away.
Oh, so they're not just waiting for a finished product to test.
No, they're involved from the ground up.
So it's about being proactive.
Yeah, exactly. And as the project goes on, you got to keep that documentation updated
Right, because things change.
all the time. Software development is iterative, things are constantly evolving.
The documentation has to keep up.
Exactly. Make sure everyone's working with the latest information.
So it's like making sure our map is always up to date.
That's a great analogy. We don't want to get lost along the way.
And speaking of maps and keeping things organized,
Yeah.
what about version control?
Oh, that's crucial. Just like with code, you need to track changes to your documentation.
So we can see who made what changes and when.
Exactly. And you can revert back to previous versions if you need to.
So it's kind of like having a time machine for your documents.
Yeah, you can always go back in time and see how things have evolved.
That's really helpful. And I imagine it also helps with collaboration.
Absolutely. Multiple people can work on the same document.
And we can see who's doing what.
Exactly. Tools like Git are great for this.
Okay, so get the QA team involved early, keep the documentation updated, use version control.
Yeah, those are some key best practices.
What about the actual writing? Any tips for that?
Yeah, keep it clear and concise.
So no need to write a novel.
No novels. Get straight to the point. Use simple language.
Avoid the jargon.
Right. Make sure everyone can understand what you're saying.
Okay, so clear, concise writing.
Yeah, that's essential.
Now let's talk about the advantages of good documentation.
Oh, there are so many.
I bet. So what are some of the biggest benefits?
Well, one of the most important is that it reduces uncertainty.
Uncertainty in what way?
Well, everyone knows exactly what needs to be tested, how it should be tested, and what the criteria for success are.
So it's like having a clear roadmap for the whole team.
Exactly. No more guesswork. Everyone's on the same page.
And that saves time and headaches down the road.
Absolutely. Another big advantage is that it serves as training material
Oh, that's a good point.
for new team members.
Yeah, new people can come in and quickly get up to speed.
Right. They can read the documentation and understand the process.
So it helps with onboarding and knowledge transfer.
Exactly.
Now, we talked earlier about how testing can take up a big chunk of the development time.
Yeah. Sometimes even 30 to 50%.
Right. So is there a risk of like over-documenting?
Yeah, that's a good question. You definitely don't want to get bogged down in documentation.
So how do we find that balance?
You got to be strategic to prioritize what's important.
Focus on the critical aspects
The things that really need to be documented.
where clarity is essential.
Exactly.
We can't talk about the future of testing without talking about AI and automation.
Oh, yeah, the robots are coming.
So how do you think these technologies will impact test documentation?
Well, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, are we going to have AI writing all our test cases for us?
I don't think AI will completely replace human testers,
Right.
but I do think it can help us be more efficient.
Yeah, make things easier.
Like there are already tools that can generate test cases automatically,
Oh, wow.
and they can analyze code for potential vulnerabilities.
So it's like having a robot assistant helping us with the boring stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It frees up human testers to focus on more complex tasks.
Like what kind of tasks?
Things like exploratory testing or risk analysis.
So the stuff that requires human intuition and creativity.
Exactly.
So it's not about eliminating documentation altogether.
No.
It's about using AI to make it more efficient.
So we can focus on the things that really matter.
That makes a lot of sense.
And, as AI gets more sophisticated, we'll need to learn how to work with it effectively.
Yeah, become AI whisperers.
Right. We'll need to understand its limitations and how to guide its efforts.
So it's a collaboration
Exactly. Humans and AI working together,
to build better software.
that's the goal.
This is all really insightful. It seems like the future of test documentation is all about finding that balance
Yeah, a balance between human expertise and AI assistance.
and always keeping in mind the goal of building high-quality software.
Absolutely.
Okay, so before we move on, let's just recap some of the key points we've covered.
Yeah, good idea.
We talked about getting the QA team involved early,
Right from the start.
keeping the documentation updated,
Using version control. writing clearly and concisely.
And thinking about how AI can help us,
It's all about being strategic and adaptable.
and always focusing on quality.
Exactly.
Now, one thing I want to touch on before we wrap up is the human side of documentation.
Oh, yeah, that's important.
It's not just about the tools and processes.
It's about the people.
How do we create a culture of documentation within our teams?
Ah, that's a great question and one we should definitely dive into.
Yeah, because it's not enough to just tell people to document their work,
No, you got to create an environment where it's valued.
where it's seen as an essential part of the process.
But before we get into that,
Yeah.
let's give you a moment to think about everything we've discussed so far.
Take a deep breath. Process all this information.
And we'll be back soon to explore the cultural side of documentation.
All right, so welcome back. We've been talking all about test documentation, the why, the what, and the how.
Yeah, really trying to get to the heart of it.
Exactly. And now we want to shift gears a little bit and talk about you, the listener.
Yeah, how can you take all this information and make it work for you?
Right. How can you apply these insights and really level up your own texting game?
We've covered a lot of different types of documents, the role of AI and all that.
Yeah, so much good stuff.
But ultimately, it's about how you can use this knowledge to build better software.
Exactly. So if you're listening to this, you're obviously interested in improving your test documentation skills.
Yeah, you're here for a reason.
So what's like the one key takeaway you should walk away with today?
The one thing to remember, I'd say it's this. Test documentation. It's not just about checking boxes.
Right. It's not just a formality.
Yeah, it's not about blindly following rules.
I've got to have a purpose.
It's about communication clarity and making sure your software is top-notch.
Right. It's about creating that shared understanding within your team.
Yeah, and having a roadmap for building a really great product.
So instead of seeing it as a chore, we should really view documentation as a valuable tool.
Yeah, it's your secret weapon for success.
But we've also talked about the dangers of over-documenting.
Yeah, you don't want to get bogged down in paperwork.
Right. So how do we find that sweet spot, that balance between being thorough and being efficient?
Remember those 3 factors we discussed earlier?
The type of application organizational standards and the maturity of the development process.
Right. Those are your guiding lights.
So they help us decide how much documentation is really necessary.
Exactly. A complex medical device
Right. Super high stakes.
is going to need a lot more documentation than a simple mobile game.
Yeah. Right. It's all about context.
You got to tailor your approach to the specific project.
Okay. That makes sense.
Mm.
And remember, documentation isn't a one-time thing.
Yeah, it's a living, breathing document.
It's got to evolve with the software.
As you learn more, as things change, you got to keep that documentation updated.
And so flexibility is key.
Always be ready to adapt.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, creating a culture of documentation.
Oh, yeah, that's so important.
It's not enough to just have the right tools and processes.
It's got to be part of the company culture.
How do we make that happen? How do we make sure documentation is valued and embraced by the whole team?
Well, it starts with leadership.
Okay, so leaders need to set the example.
Exactly. If they prioritize documentation and show that it's important,
Right. They lead by example.
then the rest of the team will follow suit.
So it's not just about talking the talk.
Get to walk the walk.
Actions speak louder than words.
And you also got to give people the right tools and training.
Make it easy for them to document their work.
Yeah, if it's a hassle, no one's going to do it.
So remove the barriers,
Mm.
make it as frictionless as possible.
Yeah, see?
And what about positive reinforcement?
Oh, that's huge. Recognize people who do a good job documenting.
To celebrate those documentation heroes.
Yeah, giving them a shout out. Show your appreciation.
It's amazing how a little appreciation can go a long way.
It really can.
So to create a strong documentation culture, we need to lead by example
Empower our teams.
and celebrate those who do it well.
It's a team effort.
Absolutely. Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of test documentation.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground.
But remember, this is just the beginning.
Keep learning, keep experimenting, and keep building amazing software.
And as always, thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.